An old poor man of 90 was humiliated when he asked for food at a restaurant, but a rich woman ordered the place to close and minutes later handed him the keys, leaving everyone speechless. Mr. Walter's house looked like a relic at the edge of the city, a structure that had withstood years of neglect and whose walls now told stories of better times. The worn bricks were covered in damp stains, and the constant sound of dripping marked the rhythm of each afternoon in his solitary life. The elderly man, 90 years old, moved slowly, like someone who had watched time flow by like an unstoppable current, leaving marks on his body and in the home he inhabited. Every morning before the sun reached its peak, Mr. Walter performed his ritual of cleaning the small window in the living room, which, despite his efforts, remained foggy and opaque. The old man's hands, wrinkled and trembling, tried to wipe away the dust that accumulated day after day. As if by cleaning the window, he could see more clearly the memories that remained out of reach. Around noon, he sat in his rickety armchair, an old piece of furniture that creaked under his weight. From there, he could see the kitchen, where the remnants of a rusted gas stove and a small table with a wobbly leg reminded him of the days when, with strength and youth, he worked to fill that house with life and warmth. But now, silence filled every corner, and his only companions were the drips falling rhythmically from the ceiling and the shadows stretching across the walls each evening. That day, while he examined the cracks in the ceiling and the old photos on the wall, he heard footsteps outside. It was Mrs. Alice, his neighbor and friend for many years. The woman, 70 years old, walked slowly and steadily, and her eyes, though reflecting the weight of life, showed an unwavering tenderness toward Mr. Walter. She brought a pot wrapped in a cloth, from which a warm aroma filled the cold air of the house. "Mr. Walter, I brought you some soup," she said, placing the pot on the wobbly kitchen table. Mr. Walter offered her a grateful smile, one of those smiles that only those who have lived long can give. In a soft voice, he thanked her, and they both sat down to share time, as if it were a treasure. Mrs. Alice told him about the few updates from the neighborhood and visits from her grandchildren, and he listened in silence, feeling that those little stories filled the void that accompanied him. Their conversations were usually simple but full of meaning. That day, she reminisced about the times they used to walk together to the market, when their bodies still moved with agility. He smiled as he listened, his eyes momentarily lost in those days, feeling the weight of the bags of fruits and vegetables in his hands and the smells and sounds of the market that now only existed in his memories. After a while, Mrs. Alice said goodbye, leaving him the soup and words of encouragement. Mr. Walter watched her walk down the street until her figure disappeared in the distance. With a sigh, he closed the door and returned to his armchair, where he sank into his thoughts, reviewing every detail of his life, as if each memory were a precious object to be examined carefully. As night fell, the sound of rain began to fill the air. The drops tapped on the roof, and water seeped through the same old cracks, creating small puddles that Mr. Walter contained with carefully placed buckets. Each drip was a sign of the fragility of his home, of his own body, which also weakened with time. That night, as he listened to the storm, Mr. Walter wondered how much longer he could endure. He knew his life was a long sequence of solitary, repetitive days, but he also knew that every moment of his existence had been marked by the dignity of facing the passage of time with courage. The shadows of the night enveloped him, and little by little, in the silence of his small house, Mr. Walter closed his eyes, allowing himself to be carried away by the weight of memories and stories that still pulsed in his heart. Mr. Walter's mornings had a slow, familiar rhythm, but the sound of laughter and hurried footsteps occasionally broke that monotonous routine. On the other side of the dusty window, he could see Charlie, the 12-year-old boy who lived on the same street, running and playing with other kids from the neighborhood. Charlie had an energy that contrasted with Mr. Walter's slower pace. However, there was something between them that transcended age differences and connected them in a special way. That day, As Mr. Walter went through his belongings, he heard a soft knock on the door. When he opened it, he found Charlie, his face lit up, and a bag of bread in his hand. The boy, with the shyness of someone about to do something important, extended the bag toward him. "My parents gave me this bread, but I thought you might like it, Mr. Walter," he said with a satisfied smile. Mr. Walter accepted the bread and gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder. Without needing to say it in words, they both understood the gesture. It was Charlie's way of caring for him, giving back a little of what he had received over the years. After all, Mr. Walter had been a mentor to him, someone who always offered a wise word or a fascinating story from the past. The old man invited Charlie in, and together they sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table. Mr. Walter broke the bread, and while they ate in silence, the boy looked at him curiously, eager to hear a story. As if reading his thoughts, Mr. Walter began to tell him about his youth, about the days when he worked in construction and helped build the buildings that still stood in some corner of the city. "I remember carrying bags of cement and beams bigger than myself," he said with a wistful smile. "Those were hard times, but we had strength, and above all, a reason to work." Charlie listened intently, as if each word from Mr. Walter opened a door to an unknown world. He admired the strength the old man must have had in those years, and the way he spoke about helping others without asking for anything in return. Charlie saw him as a role model, someone who showed him the value of generosity and honesty through every story. After a while, the boy offered to help with the day's chores. Together, they took a bucket of water and headed to the nearby fountain, where Charlie filled the bucket and carried it with pride, showing off his strength to Mr. Walter. The old man, moved, watched him in silence, recalling the youth he had left behind and seeing in the boy a promise of continuity, as if part of his values could be perpetuated in him. "Charlie, never forget that generosity is the only thing we have left when everything else is gone," he said, resting a hand on his shoulder. The boy nodded, feeling the weight of those words. To him, Mr. Walter was a sage, someone who had lived long enough to understand what truly mattered in life. From that moment on, Charlie began to admire him not only as a neighbor or a friend, but as a mentor, a figure of respect and affection who inspired him to be a better person. As the sun began to set, Charlie said goodbye, promising to return the next day to help with whatever was needed. Mr. Walter watched him walk away, feeling a mix of nostalgia and gratitude for having such a loyal and vibrant companion amid his solitude. He knew the boy still didn't understand the value of those little actions, but he did. For Mr. Walter, just seeing Charlie day after day was a reminder that, despite time and difficulties, his life could still have purpose. That night, when silence filled the house again, Mr. Walter sat by the window, watching the lights of the neighboring houses and reflecting on the bond he shared with the boy. In his eyes, Charlie was much more than a curious neighbor. He was a spark of hope, a possibility of leaving something good in the world, something that would endure even after he was gone. He closed his eyes and smiled, feeling in his heart that, for the first time in a long time, he was not alone. That morning, upon waking, Mr. Walter felt something different in his body. The weakness that had been with him for the past few days intensified, and his empty stomach reminded him with a constant pang of his lack of food. He got up with difficulty and made his way to the kitchen, hoping to find some trace of food he might have overlooked, but the empty shelves and the old rusted stove seemed to look back at him with mute sadness. With slow steps, he approached the small pantry where he used to keep rice, beans, and some canned goods. The shelves were bare. It had been days since he had consumed the last remnants of bread and the coffee grounds. The lack of food was something he had started to notice in recent weeks, but his pride, his unyielding dignity, prevented him from asking for help. He had spent his whole life caring for others, helping those in need of a nudge or advice. Now, facing the reality of his own need was almost unbearable. He stopped at the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the floor, and realized he was more tired than ever. That day, he wouldn't have the strength to make the usual repairs around the house, and the simple act of getting out of bed had become a monumental task. He thought of Mrs. Alice, who sometimes brought him a bit of soup, and of Charlie, the boy who occasionally brought him bread. He knew they too had needs, that both lived with just enough. "I can't burden them with my problems," he told himself, trying to contain the growing despair. Throughout the day, he tried to distract himself with chores, but the sensation of emptiness in his stomach became more urgent. He remembered the years of his youth, when hard work was his way of facing any difficulty. He had endured illnesses and times of scarcity, but always managed on his own. He felt that somehow, depending on others would be a betrayal of the strength that had always defined his character. As the shadows of the afternoon began to fill the room, he approached an old photograph hanging on the wall. It was an image of him as a young man, with a firm face and eyes shining with determination. "What would that young man say about me now?" he thought, feeling a mix of shame and sadness. It was as if the image reproached him for his current weakness, reminding him that he had once been strong, that he had once been able to face any challenge without needing anyone. But hunger was still there, growing in intensity, and for the first time in a long time, Mr. Walter felt that his body was about to give up. He knew he couldn't go on like this, that sooner or later he would have to find a solution, but every fiber of his being fought against the idea of asking for help. As night fell, while the echo of his own footsteps resonated in the silence of the house, Mr. Walter sat in his armchair, looking out the window. He saw the few neighbors still on the street returning to their homes, closing their doors. His eyes focused on the lights that lit up in the center of the city, places he knew well from his youth, where people went to enjoy a good meal and the company of others. For a moment, he felt a strange mix of temptation and fear. He could try to make his way to the city center, look for a place where he could ask for something to eat. The idea seemed both unsustainable and, at the same time, inevitable. His pride told him he shouldn't expose himself that way, but hunger insisted, slowly breaking down that barrier that had sustained him for so long. Finally, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to find the strength to make a decision. He knew that what was at stake was not just a plate of food, but his own dignity, his history, that strength that had kept him standing for so many years. But he also knew that if he didn't do something soon, weakness would eventually overpower him. That night, as he lay down, he made a resolution. The next day, after a long time of resistance, he would leave his home and walk to the city center, seeking the help he so desperately needed. It was a decision he struggled to accept, and the knot in his throat reminded him that he was about to break a promise he had made to himself, to never ask for anything at the expense of his own dignity. As he tried to fall asleep, images of his life flashed before his eyes, as if the weight of all those years bore down on him in a single night. The decision was made, and although pride still fought within him, hunger and need gave him the courage to face what was to come. With a heavy heart and closed eyes, Mr. Walter surrendered to the silence of the night, aware that by dawn he would begin a journey he had never imagined undertaking. Dawn arrived with a grey and pale light seeping through the windows of Mr. Walter's small house. That day, the morning routine felt different. The air had a special weight, and the decision he had made the night before lingered in his mind like a persistent shadow. As he dressed in his worn clothes and cleaned his shoes as best as he could, a mix of shame and determination reflected in his gaze. Upon stepping outside, the morning chill ran down his back, but his stride was slow and steady. The streets that had seen him walk for years, that knew the strength of his youthful days, now welcomed him in silence. The grey buildings, the closed shop doors, and the echo of his own footsteps reminded him that, in a way, he was crossing an invisible line. He had spent his whole life striving not to depend on anyone, and now, at 90 years old, he had to set that pride aside, even though every fiber of his being urged him to turn back. As he moved toward the city center, The distance felt endless, each step heavier than the last. He walked with his head down, feeling that the few passers-by who walked by could see his shame. He tried to divert his thoughts, recalling moments in his life when he had helped others, as if that could give him the strength to accept the help he now needed. He thought of the times he had offered a helping hand, without expecting anything in return. Perhaps, in some corner of the city, he would find someone willing to give him a chance. Finally, he arrived at the center. There, the buildings were tall and elegant, and the bustle of people coming and going contrasted sharply with the calm of his neighborhood. He stopped in front of a restaurant that seemed to shine amid the streets. The glass facade revealed its luxurious interior, filled with well-dressed people chatting and laughing around tables laden with exquisite dishes. He observed the shiny cutlery, the crystal glasses, and the details of the plates with a mix of wonder and anxiety. The restaurant was called La Cima, and the name, written in golden letters on the glass door, felt ironic at that moment, not only because of the chasm that separated him from that place, but because the peak of his life seemed to be long gone, lost in some distant memory. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the entrance, feeling that movement was as difficult as carrying heavy bags of cement from his youth. The interior of the restaurant was so pristine and orderly that it seemed like another world. The aroma of spices, the elegant voices of the diners, and the soft sound of background music enveloped him in an atmosphere completely foreign to him. With his gaze fixed on the floor and his heart racing, he made his way to the counter, where a well-dressed man was talking to the staff. It was Simon, the restaurant owner, a man in his 40s, impeccably groomed, with a calculating expression. Simon immediately noticed Mr. Walter and frowned, looking him up and down as if he were a stain in his perfect environment. Mr. Walter, with humility and respect, raised his gaze just enough to make his request. "Excuse me, I would just like a bit of food," he said in a low, trembling tone. "Anything you can offer me will be enough." Simon, instead of listening empathetically, looked at him with disdain. With a gesture of arrogance, he raised his voice so that the employees and some nearby customers could hear him. "A bit of food?" Simon repeated mockingly. "And what makes you think a place like this is for someone like you?" Mr. Walter felt each word hit him like a weight in his chest. His gaze dropped to the ground, but he still did not move. Simon continued, his tone laden with contempt and a cruel smile on his face. "Perhaps you don't know where you are, old man," Simon went on, exaggerating his tone. "This is a first-class restaurant, a place for people who can pay. Not for—" He paused, measuring his words maliciously. "Beggars." The laughter of some employees and the awkward glances of other diners filled the space. Mr. Walter, with his heart shriveled and his dignity shattered, began to turn away, ready to leave. But deep down, something in him still wanted to resist. A fragment of his former pride refused to let humiliation defeat him completely. At that moment, the echo of Simon's words resonating in the restaurant activated within Mr. Walter something he hadn't felt in a long time, a profound sadness that went beyond his hunger or need. It was the loneliness of the years, the indifference of a society that only valued what shone, and the feeling that, despite having given so much in his life, he found himself discarded. With one last effort, Mr. Walter walked toward the exit, each step heavier than the last. As he crossed the door, he glanced at the restaurant's golden sign, remembering what he once was, a strong man who stood tall with dignity. Now, as he walked away, Simon's words echoed in his mind, and he felt that with each step, he was leaving a piece of himself behind in that place. The city now seemed like a hostile territory to him, and with a wounded soul and an empty stomach, he began the journey back home, consumed by a mix of shame and hopelessness that seemed endless. Mr. Walter stumbled away from the restaurant's door, feeling the weight of humiliation like a dark mantle on his shoulders. Behind him were the cruel words of Simon and the curious gazes of the customers who had witnessed the scene without intervening. However, Just as he was about to disappear into the shadows of the street, the glass door of the restaurant swung open with a dry and decisive sound. A woman hurried out, heading directly toward him. Emma, a woman in her 50s with a firm demeanor and understated elegance, had witnessed everything from her table. She had come to the restaurant for a business meeting that no longer seemed important after what she had just seen. Her serious and determined face revealed that something about the scene with Mr. Walter and Simon had deeply moved her. She approached him and gently stopped him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Excuse me, sir. Please wait a moment," she said in a firm yet kind voice. Mr. Walter looked up at her, somewhat taken aback. He was about to apologize and continue on his way, but Emma, not letting him go, turned her head toward the restaurant and regarded the owner with a look of resolve, who was watching her from inside with surprise. Without releasing Mr. Walter's arm, Emma stepped back into the restaurant, taking him with her. The diners still inside fell silent, whispering among themselves and watching expectantly. Simon, who had returned to his conversation with an employee, turned at the sight of them entering again and frowned, clearly irritated. "Is there a problem?" Simon asked with an arrogant tone, still unable to grasp the seriousness in Emma's eyes. Emma looked at him unblinkingly, maintaining her composure with an authority that seemed to fill the space. She approached him directly, leaving Mr. Walter a few steps behind, and spoke in a tone that resonated throughout the restaurant. "Yes, there is a problem," she said firmly. "The problem is that I just saw how you treated this man as if he were unworthy of entering here. The problem is that you think money is the only measure of a person." Simon, clearly uncomfortable and somewhat irritated by the confrontation, attempted to justify himself with a forced smile. "Madam, with all due respect, this is not a place for people." He paused, looking back at Mr. Walter with disdain. "Like him. This restaurant has standards." Emma interrupted him with a decisive gesture, making it clear that she would not tolerate any further humiliation. "Standards?" she said with a mix of irony and anger. "Dignity and respect are the only standards that matter, and if you don't know how to respect that, then you have no idea what people are truly worth." Simon tried to respond, but Emma cut him off once again. In an act that left everyone speechless, she took out her wallet and with a serious and determined expression made a direct offer. "I want to buy this restaurant. Right now. You set the price, I'll pay." Simon was stunned. He knew who she was. Emma was known for her successful investments and her determined character. His reaction shifted from disbelief to greed in seconds. He crossed his arms, measuring the situation, and a sly smile appeared on his face. "Are you serious?" he asked, glancing around and noticing that all the employees and customers were watching the scene. Emma looked him directly in the eyes, reaffirming that she was indeed serious. "How much?" she insisted in a firm voice. After a brief silence, Simon mentioned an exorbitant figure, as if he wanted to dissuade her or embarrass her. But Emma, without hesitation, accepted the offer. They agreed on the sale right there, amid the surprise of the employees and the anticipation of the customers who still dared not leave. Within minutes, Simon, seeing the money transferred to his account, handed over the keys with a mix of surprise and resignation. With the contract signed and the keys in her possession, Emma, who had not let go of Mr. Walter's arm until then, turned to him and extended the keys of the restaurant. Mr. Walter, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening, looked at her with eyes filled with astonishment and contained emotion. "This place is now yours, Mr. Walter," she said gently. "What I just did is nothing more than giving you back a bit of the dignity you deserve." Deep down, Emma remembered her grandfather, that generous and dignified man who had raised her when she was a child. Her grandfather, like Mr. Walter, had always been someone who helped without asking for anything in return, someone who had never been afraid to open the doors of his home to those in need. He had passed away when she was just a girl, and since then, every man who reminded her of that kindness and warmth awakened in her the desire to protect and help, as if in some way she could honor her grandfather's memory. "This place was yours, Grandpa," she murmured to herself as she watched Mr. Walter hold the keys with trembling hands. Mr. Walter looked at her, still speechless. Emotion overwhelmed him, and his eyes, filled with tears, seemed to express the gratitude and disbelief he felt. Emma stepped closer to him and smiled tenderly. "I know this is a big change, but you don't have to do it alone. I will be here to help you every step of the way," she said sincerely. The employees, who had until then been witnesses to the scene, began to understand the depth of what was happening. Some, ashamed of how they had laughed at Mr. Walter just moments before, lowered their gaze. Emma, aware of the importance of this moment, spoke to everyone, making it clear that under Mr. Walter's leadership, this place would change in more than one sense. "From today, this restaurant will not just be a luxury place," she announced. "It will be a space where everyone, regardless of their condition, will be treated with respect and dignity. Because that is true greatness." Murmurs spread among the employees, and some exchanged glances, unsure how to react. Mr. Walter, in silence, absorbed every word, and a spark of hope and gratitude began to ignite in his heart. After assuring him that they would return the next day to discuss the future of the restaurant, Emma bid him farewell with a smile. Mr. Walter, now alone at the entrance of the place he had just received, looked at the keys in his hand. He held them as if they were something sacred, a symbol of more than just a business, an opportunity, a second life. As the sun began to set, Mr. Walter closed the restaurant door and began his walk home. His steps were now firm and light, and a timid smile appeared on his face. He knew that despite his age, there was still something for him in this world, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger reminded him that miracles existed. That night, upon arriving home, he sat in his old armchair and looked at the ceiling, feeling that his life, for the first time in a long time, had a new purpose. The next morning, the first rays of the sun filled Mr. Walter's house with a soft, golden light, as if announcing the start of something special. He woke up feeling an energy he hadn't experienced in years, a mix of excitement and nervousness. The keys to the restaurant rested on his wobbly table, and although he had spent the night watching them, he still found it hard to believe what had happened the day before. He prepared himself as best as he could. He carefully cleaned his clothes, smoothed his grey hair, and made sure his shoes were as presentable as years of wear allowed. As he looked at his reflection in the broken bathroom mirror, he couldn't help but remember the dignity he had once felt in his youth, when his appearance reflected the strength of a hard-working man. Now, however, what he saw in the mirror was a wrinkled face, marked by the trials of time. But that morning, something was different. In his eyes sparkled a renewed glimmer, a mix of hope and pride. With a steady step, he made his way to the restaurant, clutching the keys as if they were a treasure. Upon arriving, he paused in front of the facade and contemplated the golden sign of Dice, La Cima, the same place where just a day before he had experienced one of the greatest humiliations of his life. Now that luxurious and distant space belonged to him, and he looked at it with a mix of wonder and gratitude. A few minutes later, Emma arrived, elegant and confident as always, with a warm and reassuring smile. Upon seeing Mr. Walter waiting for her, she gave him a light pat on the shoulder, and they exchanged a knowing glance. "Ready for your first day, Mr. Walter?" she asked with a smile. He nodded, although a slight unease flickered across his face. "I'm not quite sure how to handle all of this, Miss Emma," he confessed, lowering his gaze. "At my age, one doesn't expect to start over. I feel out of place." Emma listened attentively, and then, in a gentle yet determined tone, began to tell him the story she had kept in her heart since meeting him. She spoke of her grandfather, a man with a generous and simple heart, someone who always found a way to help others, even when he barely had anything for himself. She recounted how he had raised her in her childhood, teaching her the importance of humility and kindness, values she had always carried with her in every step of her life. "My grandfather was my greatest teacher," she said, her eyes filled with emotion. "He was the first to show me that true wealth is not in what we have, but in what we can give. I lost him when I was just a little girl, and I was left with a void, a desire to give back, in some way, all that he gave me. When I saw you, Mr. Walter, at the door of the restaurant, I felt as if he himself were there, asking for help." Mr. Walter listened attentively, surprised and deeply moved. Emma's gaze was sincere and filled with nostalgia, and in her voice there was an affection that went beyond a mere act of charity. He understood now that that gesture, that handing over of the keys, was not just assistance. It was Emma's way of honoring her grandfather's memory through someone who shared the same essence. "I know you are the ideal man to run this restaurant," Emma said firmly. "Here you can create something beautiful, something he would have done too. You have something that few possess, the generosity of someone who has lived and given without expecting anything in return. I will be here to guide you, but I trust that together we will make this place worthy of your story and mine." Emma's words filled Mr. Walter with a serenity he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he felt that this place, despite its elegance and shine, could become a space close to his heart, a place where he could be himself, where his life and values would have a tangible purpose. Without saying more, he nodded, feeling that, in some way, Emma had given him a second chance, not just to receive, but to keep giving. Emma suggested they tour the inside of the restaurant together so he could begin to familiarize himself with every corner, every table, and every detail of the place that was now his. They entered, and as they moved through the elegantly decorated dining room filled with paintings and lamps, Mr. Walter observed every aspect of the space with a look of respect. Emma explained how the kitchen worked, the different services, and the management system, but she also spoke of her idea to transform the place into an accessible site, a place that reflected the generosity and humility of its new owner. "I want this to be a place where people don't just come to eat," Emma said as they admired the decor, "but where they feel welcome, where they can find a refuge, a place that truly gives them something of value." Mr. Walter looked around the dining room, trying to imagine simple people, like himself, sharing a meal in this place that would have rejected them before. His eyes scanned the tables and chairs, envisioning each detail transformed into something cozy and simple, something that could bring warmth and dignity to those who came. The idea that this restaurant could be a supportive space for the needy began to take shape in his mind like a spark, an illusion of turning the space into a home for others, just as he had always tried to do with his acts of kindness. When they finished the tour, Mr. Walter and Emma sat at one of the tables in front of a window that let in the midday light. They both sat in silence for a moment, allowing the moment to take on its own meaning. Then Emma broke the silence. "This is your space now, Mr. Walter. I'm here to support you every step of the way, but what's most important will be the essence you give it. Turn it into what your heart dictates." Mr. Walter, moved and grateful, extended his hand, which Emma held warmly. He didn't know how to express in words what he felt, but he understood that this place now had a purpose that gave meaning to his life. It was an unexpected destiny, a mission that, far from feeling like a burden, filled him with renewed fervor. As he left the restaurant that day, Mr. Walter looked back one last time, no longer seeing it as an unattainable and distant place, but as a space of possibilities. With Emma by his side, he felt he could create something that bore the mark of those who taught him the true value of generosity. What had begun as an act of kindness had transformed into a mission, into a new life for him. That night, when he arrived home, Mr. Walter sat by his window, watching the sunset's reflection over the neighborhood rooftops. Now he knew he had the chance to transform his world and that of others, and in his chest beat a mix of gratitude and excitement. The following days were a flurry of activity in the restaurant, a constant movement of changes and adaptations. Mr. Walter and Emma worked side by side with an energy that seemed inexhaustible, transforming that luxurious place into something completely new and unique. The first major task was to strip the space of its ostentation. The elegant paintings and crystal lamps were removed, and the dark marble tables gave way to simple wooden tables that emanated warmth. At first, the employees watched with surprise and even some skepticism as they saw the restaurant being dismantled and redecorated. Some wondered if such radical changes could attract the same customers as before, but Emma's determination and Mr. Walter's calmness instilled a strange confidence in them. Gradually, several workers began to approach and offer their help, intrigued by the project that was taking shape. Charlie, Mr. Walter's young neighbor, became a constant figure in the restaurant during the process. He showed up every afternoon after school, eager to lend a hand. He cleaned windows, swept away the dust that had accumulated behind the moved furniture, and meticulously organized the few simple decorations that adorned the place. For him, watching Mr. Walter transform a place like this was like witnessing a miracle, and his eyes sparkled with excitement every time he carried a box or hung up a sign. The new atmosphere of the restaurant began to reflect the character of its owner, simple yet full of heart. Instead of the expensive paintings that had once adorned the walls, they decided to fill them with photographs of the city, images of the squares and streets that Mr. Walter had walked throughout his life. Each image told a story of the community, a reminder that the restaurant belonged to everyone, not just to a privileged elite. In one corner of the dining room, Emma installed a large chalkboard where they wrote the new menu, which now featured simple and affordable dishes: vegetable soup, homemade stews, freshly baked bread, and hot coffee. Next to the menu, they placed a sign explaining the suspended meals system, the idea they had developed so that anyone could donate a meal, and in that way ensure that those who arrived in need would not leave empty-handed. The first day the restaurant opened under this new philosophy was filled with anticipation and nerves. Mr. Walter positioned himself near the door, greeting each person who crossed the threshold with a warm smile. The first to enter were curious neighbors who, upon seeing the new welcoming atmosphere and Mr. Walter's kindness, felt right at home. Among them were Mrs. Alice, with her slow gait, and other familiar faces from the neighborhood who greeted Mr. Walter affectionately, intrigued to see what was taking shape in that place. As the restaurant filled up, Emma observed in silence, noting how the atmosphere was completely different from previous days. People chatted with one another, some introduced themselves, while others shared their stories, their everyday struggles, and their dreams. It was as if the space, stripped of its luxury, had gained something much more valuable: the warmth of a united community. Among the arriving customers was Frank, a 30-year-old man who remembered Mr. Walter with gratitude and a mix of nostalgia and shame. In his youth, when he had been a directionless boy, caught up in problems and bad decisions, he had found in Mr. Walter an unselfish support. The elderly man had offered him shelter when he needed it most, and helped him find a job that set him on the right path. However, life had pulled him away, and the years passed without him keeping in touch, or even returning a word of thanks. Since hearing about the restaurant and Mr. Walter's mission, something stirred within him. He couldn't ignore the opportunity to redeem his absence. One day, he finally decided to approach the restaurant, filled with a mix of regret and a sincere desire to support the man who had meant so much to him in the past. When he arrived at the restaurant, Frank hesitated for a moment before entering. He saw Mr. Walter attending to some customers and greeting them with his usual kindness through the window. That image brought back memories of the distant time when Mr. Walter had extended a helping hand to him and a lump formed in his throat. He took a breath, opened the door, and walked in, trying to go unnoticed among the diners. Mr. Walter noticed him instantly, as if he had been waiting for him. As soon as their eyes met, the elderly man smiled with a warmth that seemed to dispel all the years of distance. Frank, feeling like the boy he once was, approached with hesitant steps and lowered his head in respect. "Mr. Walter," he said, swallowing hard, "I wanted to thank you for what you did for me when I was young. I never told you how important you were to me." Mr. Walter looked at him with deep understanding, as if he knew that those words were not easy to pronounce. Without saying anything, he placed a hand on his shoulder and gave him a few gentle pats, acknowledging the sincerity in Frank's face. "You don't have to say anything, son," he replied in a calm voice. "I'm glad to see you again. You will always have a place here." Frank, touched by Mr. Walter's generosity, took a moment to collect his thoughts before expressing what had truly brought him there. "Mr. Walter, I want to help you in this place, in any way, as a volunteer or as a worker. I want to give back something of what you gave me back then." Mr. Walter looked at him with gratitude, surprised and moved. Not only because someone he had helped in the past was returning to his life, but because that person wanted to support his project. He felt that, in some way, the circle of generosity he had tried to maintain throughout his life was coming back to him. Without wasting any time, Mr. Walter accepted the offer, and that very afternoon, Frank began helping in the kitchen. Emma, upon hearing the story, welcomed him with the same enthusiasm, seeing in him an ally in the restaurant's mission. With humility, Frank set to work washing dishes, sweeping the floor, and chopping vegetables, seizing every task to learn and demonstrate his dedication. The first days of work were a process of adaptation. Frank was a man carrying the weight of his own mistakes, and he often worked in silence, with a focus that revealed both his remorse and his determination to amend the past. Sometimes, watching Mr. Walter serving customers or chatting with Charlie, he felt a pang of guilt for not having been there before. But the elderly man always welcomed him with a warm smile, without reproaches. As the days went by, Frank began to integrate into the team of volunteers and employees, and gradually his reserved attitude transformed into a friendly and collaborative disposition. Charlie, who had observed his arrival with a mix of curiosity and respect, quickly began to see him as a role model. The young boy saw in him someone who had also found a second chance in the restaurant, and Frank soon took him under his wing, teaching him some cooking tricks and laughing together as they organized the tasks. On one of those afternoons, while Frank and Charlie worked side by side in the kitchen, Mr. Walter approached them and proposed something that had been on his mind, that they join him in making rounds in the neighborhood and delivering some dishes to those who couldn't come to the restaurant. Frank accepted the proposal immediately, excited by the opportunity to help the community directly. For him, that activity was a way to redeem himself and, at the same time, to revive the spirit of service that Mr. Walter had taught him years ago. That very afternoon, they set out with a basket full of food. They roamed the streets, visiting houses where they knew there were elderly people or families in need. Mr. Walter, with his slow gait and warm smile, delivered, each plate with the humility that characterized him. Frank and Charlie, observing, understood the depth of that act, how true wealth lay in generosity and human connection. When they returned to the restaurant after that round of deliveries, Mr. Walter looked at them with an expression of pride, as if, in those moments, he felt that his life's mission was being shared and understood. The three of them spent some time in the kitchen, chatting about the day, and for the first time, Frank shared some stories from his life, about the challenges and decisions that had led him there. Charlie, listening intently, saw in him an example of redemption and perseverance, feeling that he was in the right place, surrounded by people who wanted to do good. That night, as Mr. Walter closed the restaurant doors, he realized that the space he had dreamed of was coming to life in a way more beautiful than he had ever imagined. The people who had once been part of his life were returning to support him and to build together that project that went beyond just a meal or a business. It was a space of opportunities, reunions, and solidarity. As he turned off the lights, he observed the restaurant in silence, feeling that each corner was now filled with memories and new possibilities. Frank had returned, not only as an old acquaintance, but as a helping hand now sharing his mission. With a full heart and the satisfaction of a well-lived day, Mr. Walter stepped out, closing the door behind him, confident that the restaurant had not only changed his life, but also the lives of all those who passed through it. Charlie arrived at the restaurant every day with overwhelming energy, ready to help with whatever was needed. For him, seeing Mr. Walter become the soul of that place was extraordinary, a change he had never imagined on his modest street. Even though he was only 12, he felt that this place belonged to him in some sense, as if by being part of the team, he was contributing to something much greater than he understood. One afternoon, Mr. Walter welcomed him with a warm smile and a new task. He guided him to the kitchen and showed him a pile of dishes that needed washing. Charlie, not losing his enthusiasm, rolled up his sleeves and began to work diligently, enjoying every moment. Mr. Walter watched from the kitchen door, feeling proud to see his young friend so committed. It was as if that place was becoming a small school of life for the boy. "Charlie, can you imagine what this restaurant will be like in a few years?" Mr. Walter asked during a break, his gaze thoughtful. Charlie paused for a moment, drying his hands on a cloth, and looked around, contemplating the kitchen that now felt so familiar to him. "I think it will be a place where everyone comes and feels good," he replied confidently. "A place where no one has to go hungry. Right, Mr. Walter?" Mr. Walter nodded, moved by the simplicity with which the boy understood the purpose of the restaurant. He knew that for Charlie, being there was much more than helping with a task. It was a way of building a worldview, learning about empathy and solidarity. Through these small actions, the boy was beginning to grasp the value of helping and the importance of creating a positive impact in the lives of others. In the following days, Mr. Walter began to assign Charlie more responsibilities. He started by teaching him how to organize utensils in the kitchen, how to keep the area clean and tidy, and then showed him how to serve dishes at the tables with kindness. Although the tasks were small, each seemed to have a special meaning for the boy, who took every instruction as a valuable lesson. Often, while serving, Charlie listened to the diners, and their stories sparked in him a mix of wonder and respect. Charlie was not the only one who had noticed Mr. Walter's transformation. The neighbors who knew the elderly man also began to see the young helper in a new light, as he had become a kind of mini-host for the restaurant. Each time he finished his tasks, Charlie would sit with Mr. Walter and ask questions about his youth and the times when the elderly man worked in construction or helped his co-workers. Mr. Walter shared stories filled with lessons, showing him how small acts of kindness had been his compass throughout his life. One afternoon, while Emma was organizing some papers at the counter, she noticed Charlie watching Mr. Walter intently from the kitchen, with the same admiration that an apprentice has for his master. Approaching him, she asked, "Charlie, do you like working here with Mr. Walter?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, his face lit up by a wide smile. "Very much, Miss Emma. He teaches me things I couldn't learn anywhere else. Here, I feel like I can do something important." Emma smiled at him, touched by his response, and gave him a piece of advice that she knew Charlie would treasure. "Then always listen to Mr. Walter and follow his example. One day, everything you learn here will help you do great things. You are a very important part of this place." Emma's comment planted a seed of confidence in Charlie, and from then on, his dedication grew even stronger. He became a small pillar in the restaurant, helping in every corner, from the kitchen to the tables, always with a cheerful and helpful attitude that spread to everyone who entered. His role in the restaurant grew to the point that diners began to recognize him and greet him affectionately each time they saw him, as if he were a symbol of the warmth of the place. On one occasion, one of the regular customers, an elderly man who always sat near the window, told Mr. Walter that he saw in Charlie a promise for the future, a generation that would inherit the values the elderly man had instilled. Hearing those words filled Mr. Walter with profound emotion and pride. He knew that, although he might not see the restaurant in the future, Charlie would be there to preserve its spirit and continue the mission they had begun together. One night, As the restaurant was emptying and Charlie was helping to close up, Mr. Walter called him over, and they sat at one of the tables. The elderly man looked at him with a grateful expression and in a gentle voice spoke sincerely. "Charlie, you are like a son to me. Seeing you here, working with such dedication, fills me with hope. Sometimes I wonder if, in this complicated world, there are still people who can uphold the values I learned when I was young, but seeing you here makes me believe that there are." Charlie, without saying anything, took his hand firmly and nodded. He understood the responsibility that Mr. Walter was imparting to him, and in his heart, he knew he would fulfill that promise, that he would take care of the restaurant and its mission. He realized that, in some way, he was receiving something more than practical lessons. He was learning the essence of compassion, empathy, and solidarity that would make him a better person. That night, as they both left the restaurant together, Charlie looked at Mr. Walter with a mix of respect and admiration. He realized that the elderly man was not only his mentor, but also the guide who showed him the way to become the person he wanted to be. As the city lights illuminated the horizon, they walked with a shared determination, confident that the restaurant was something much bigger than just a business. It was a space where dreams were built and values were passed on that one day Charlie would ensure remained alive. With each passing day, Mr. Walter's restaurant became an increasingly special place for the community. What had started as a simple idea of help and hospitality was rapidly evolving into a space of genuine connection, a place where people found comfort and companionship as much as food. Neighbors no longer walked by. Instead, they stopped, entered, and shared moments with people who were once just anonymous faces on the street. In the neighborhood, the restaurant earned the nickname the House of Everyone, and it was not hard to see why. Families from the area, young students, weary workers, and lonely elderly people found a refuge there. The stories of the people intertwined, and Mr. Walter, always present in every corner, became the thread that connected them, sharing his wisdom in heartfelt conversations while serving hot dishes and freshly brewed coffee. Emma had promoted the idea of organizing weekly community dinners, nights when the restaurant offered free meals for those in need of a hot plate or simply a place to feel welcome. The community dinners quickly became the most anticipated event of the week. On dinner days, the restaurant filled with laughter, conversations, and grateful glances. People of all ages gathered around long shared tables, where the atmosphere was warm and festive. During one of these dinners, Mrs. Alice, the neighbor who had visited Mr. Walter so many times at his home, arrived at the restaurant accompanied by her grandchildren. The scene was heartwarming. Mrs. Alice, a woman of simple appearance with hands weathered by work, shared a moment of joy with her old friend Mr. Walter alongside her family. As they dined, Mrs. Alice lovingly took his hand and thanked him for creating such a kind space. "I never thought I would see something like this on our street, Mr. Walter. This place is a blessing for all of us," she said, her eyes shining with emotion. Mr. Walter returned her smile and squeezed her hand. Inside, he felt that all the sacrifices of his life, all the humility with which he had lived, had been worth it to witness that moment. The restaurant had become the manifestation of a dream, a reflection of his life of service and generosity. Charlie, as always, ran around with his boundless enthusiasm, serving dishes, refilling glasses, and chatting with customers as if they were lifelong friends. For him, community dinners had become an opportunity to see firsthand the impact of his work. Seeing the grateful smiles on each person's face was, for him, an invaluable reward. On that same day, Frank was also there, working in the kitchen alongside the other volunteers. He and Charlie had become something of a duo in the restaurant, collaborating on every task, from washing dishes to organizing tables. As the days passed, Frank found in his service a way to redeem himself, a sense of purpose that filled the void left by the years he had lived apart from Mr. Walter and his own values. Each time someone thanked him with a smile, he felt that his efforts were meaningful. That particular night, a group of young people from a neighboring area approached the restaurant for the first time. They were kids who, like Charlie, spent their afternoons on the street and rarely found a place where they felt welcomed. They entered with curiosity and a bit of distrust, but soon Charlie greeted them with a genuine smile and invited them to sit at one of the tables. Mr. Walter watched from the kitchen, and seeing them converse and share, he realized that his restaurant could also be a place for youth, an alternative to the streets and bad influences. At the end of dinner, Emma proposed an idea that everyone received with enthusiasm: to organize a gratitude wall. On one of the empty walls of the restaurant, a space would be installed where each person could leave a message, a thought, or a note of thanks. Mr. Walter was delighted with the idea, and in the days that followed, the wall began to fill with messages written on colorful pieces of paper, small acknowledgements reflecting the impact the place was having on each person. The messages were varied and came from people of all ages and circumstances. "Thank you for the food and companionship in a difficult time," read one note signed by a young student. "This place reminds me that there is still kindness in the world," wrote an elderly woman. "To Mr. Walter, for teaching me to help without expecting anything in return," left Frank, as a display of his deep gratitude and remorse. Mr. Walter read each message, moved, feeling that each word was a tribute to his life and the mission he had accepted. The restaurant was no longer just a physical place. It had become a symbol of unity and hope, a space that transcended social and economic barriers, where everyone, regardless of where they came from, could find a home. One night after dinner, Mr. Walter stayed in the restaurant observing the wall of gratitude. Emma approached him and gave him a pat on the shoulder, noticing the emotion in his gaze. "Look at everything you have achieved, Mr. Walter. You have created a place where everyone feels important, where every story has value and every person finds a place," she said proudly. Mr. Walter nodded, his voice slightly choked with emotion. "I never imagined that, at my age, I could see something like this. This restaurant has given me so much more than I could have given to others. It is a gift, an opportunity I never thought I would have." Emma smiled, aware that the restaurant had become the heart of the community, a refuge where people not only shared a meal, but also their dreams, struggles, and hopes. As Mr. Walter left the restaurant that night, he took one last look, observing the empty tables, the warm lights, and the wall of gratitude filled with messages. He realized that each dish served, each smile shared, and each word of encouragement had left an indelible mark on that place. The restaurant had fulfilled its purpose, not only in feeding bodies, but also in nourishing hearts. With his soul filled with peace, Mr. Walter closed the door, confident that, although one day he might no longer be there, the spirit of the house of everyone would continue to thrive, reminding everyone of the transformative power of kindness and community. Meanwhile, Simon, the former owner of the restaurant, had been hearing rumors about the success of his former business, but at first he dismissed them. It seemed impossible to him that Mr. Walter, an elderly man with no experience, could make that place thrive with something as abstract as generosity and humility. Simon, accustomed to measuring success in terms of luxury and exclusivity, could not comprehend what kind of magic was now attracting so many people to the restaurant he had sold without any remorse. After the sale, Simon had invested the money in several businesses, trying to maintain the status he valued so much. But paradoxically, fate seemed to have played a trick on him. One by one, his new ventures failed, plunging him into a spiral of losses and debts. The luxurious projects he had imagined failed to capture people's interest, and the accumulated costs began to drain his resources, leaving him with almost nothing. Every day, Simon passed by Mr. Walter's restaurant, now known in the neighborhood as the House of Everyone. From across the street, he watched how the place he had discarded so thoughtlessly filled with people coming and going with cheerful faces. The murmurs of people about Mr. Walter's kindness and humility, about the restaurant as a symbol of unity and hope, penetrated him deeply. It was as if an invisible thorn pierced deeper into his pride. Without the income that had once allowed him to live comfortably, Simon found that many of the people who used to frequent his company now avoided him or treated him with indifference. He no longer had the luxury of surrounding himself with those who admired him for his success. Instead, loneliness and the emptiness he had always tried to fill with material things became a reality he could no longer ignore. With each failure, with each closed door, he began to question the superficiality of his life, the way he had valued appearances over people. One afternoon, Simon decided to approach the restaurant, although the idea felt humiliating. Seeing that place so full of life, with walls decorated with messages of gratitude, filled him with a mix of astonishment and shame. He remembered the cruel treatment he had given to Mr. Walter the last time he saw him, and now he felt the weight of his arrogance like a heavy burden dragging him down. He paused in front of the entrance, head down, unsure whether to proceed or if he even had the right to do so. At that moment, Emma saw him from inside and noticed his dejected expression. She remembered well how Simon had humiliated Mr. Walter, but she also understood the depth of his remorse. With a calm gesture, she approached him and, without saying a word, invited him to enter. Simon, surprised by the invitation, stepped through the threshold with hesitant steps, observing the place that had once been his, now transformed into a space full of warmth. Upon seeing him, Mr. Walter paused from what he was doing and approached with his characteristic serenity. His eyes, filled with compassion, seemed to understand what was going through Simon's mind, and without a single word of reproach, he extended his hand. Simon, with a trembling voice, began to apologize, acknowledging his mistakes and the lack of humility with which he had treated Mr. Walter. "Mr. Walter, I know I have no right to ask for anything after how I behaved. I just wanted to tell you that I deeply regret the way I treated you. I was an arrogant man, and I didn't see the value in you or this place," Simon said, his voice filled with sincerity. Mr. Walter, instead of condemning him, looked at him with compassion. He knew that Simon was facing his own demons, grappling with shame and guilt. In that moment, he offered something more valuable than a simple apology, a chance for redemption. "Simon, there is always something to do here, and a hand that needs help," he said calmly. "If you want, you can join us and help here like everyone else. In this restaurant, we do not judge anyone by their mistakes, but by the effort they make to change." Simon was stunned. He could not comprehend how someone he had publicly humiliated could be capable of giving him a second chance without any resentment. Mr. Walter's words opened a door for him, and after a moment of hesitation, he accepted the offer, feeling that this was the only way left for him to find some peace. The first few weeks were a challenge. Simon, accustomed to being in charge and being served, found himself in a completely different role. Now, instead of giving orders, he was washing dishes, cleaning tables, and serving people he would have previously ignored. The experience was tough, and often, while scrubbing a pile of dishes in the kitchen, he thought about the times he had belittled the work of those around him. He felt how each task stripped away a bit of his ego, of the superficiality that had guided his life. Simon began to listen to the stories of the diners, their struggles and hopes, and little by little, he understood the true value of what Mr. Walter had built. Those people did not come just for the food. They came because in that place they felt valued, heard, and treated with respect. Mr. Walter was not just the owner. He was the soul of that space, and his example had transformed the restaurant into something much greater. One day, while helping to organize a community dinner, Simon saw an elderly man sitting alone at a table, looking sad. Remembering his own recent experiences, he decided to approach him and listen to his story. He discovered that the man had lost his home and was going through a difficult situation. Instead of judging him, Simon served him a warm plate and stayed to talk with him until the man felt comforted. It was the first time in a long time that Simon found satisfaction in an act of empathy, expecting nothing in return. With each act of kindness, Simon began to understand what Mr. Walter had taught him without saying it. True success was not in money or status, but in the impact each person left on the lives of others. Slowly, he earned the trust of his colleagues and the diners, who began to see him not as the arrogant man he once was, but as someone genuinely remorseful and committed to his change. At the end of a workday, Simon stayed with Mr. Walter and Charlie, observing the empty restaurant. In a soft voice, he expressed what he had learned during those days. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Mr. Walter. I never understood what it truly meant to help others, and you have given me the privilege of discovering it here." Mr. Walter smiled at him and patted him on the shoulder. "We all need a second chance, Simon. What matters is learning to make the most of it." That night, when Simon left the restaurant, he felt he was carrying something more valuable than the money he had once longed for. He had found in humility and service a purpose he had never experienced, and like the restaurant, a new way of seeing the world had been reborn in him. Simon had begun to adapt to his new life in the restaurant, although each day he faced challenges that led him to reassess his own values and past decisions. The life of luxury and success he once considered fundamental had faded away, and what remained was a simple routine, but filled with meaning. Little by little, Simon discovered that serving others was not a burden, but an opportunity to transform his life and redeem himself. However, the humility that the work demanded was not easy to assimilate. Sometimes, while cleaning tables or serving plates, he recalled the public humiliation he had inflicted on Mr. Walter and felt a pang of shame that accompanied him in every task. Each action he took was like a silent reminder of his past mistakes and, at the same time, an opportunity to be someone different. One afternoon, while serving food during one of the community dinners, Simon noticed the wall of gratitude filled with messages of thanks and hope. Among the notes, he found one written by a young person that read, "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." Reading those words sparked an unexpected impulse in Simon. He remembered the cruel treatment he had given to Mr. Walter, and he felt he not only needed to apologize, but also to demonstrate through sincere acts that he was committed to change. Thus, he began to approach the diners more and truly listen to them, something he had never done in his previous life. 1. Afternoon, while talking to an elderly man who frequently visited the restaurant, he heard a story that deeply moved him. The man, who had lost his family, found in the restaurant the only space where he felt accompanied. Simon, as he listened, understood that the restaurant meant much more than a free meal. It was a refuge for those who had been ignored by the world, just as he himself had once done. As the weeks passed, Simon began to gain the trust of the diners and the team. However, his colleagues still had doubts about him at first. They remembered well how he had run the restaurant with arrogance and disdain for customers and staff. One of the employees, a young man named Marcos, who had worked under Simon's command, was especially skeptical. Although Simon tried to prove his change, he noticed the coldness in Marcos's gaze and the few words they exchanged. One night, after finishing a long day of work, Simon approached Marcos in the kitchen. With a firm yet humble voice, he decided to confront the situation. "Marcos, I know my presence here might be uncomfortable for you," Simon began. "And I understand why. I treated you and the others poorly, and I was a boss who only thought of himself. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm here to change, and I will work hard every day to prove it." Marcos watched him in silence, and although he did not respond immediately, his eyes reflected a subtle change, a small opening toward the genuine effort Simon was showing. From then on, Marcos began to ease his attitude, and over time, he and Simon found a way to collaborate and support each other in the daily work, albeit still somewhat reservedly. A moment that profoundly impacted Simon occurred during one of the community dinners when a family of immigrants arrived at the restaurant, clearly in need of a place where they could feel safe and welcomed. Simon personally attended to them, served them food, and offered them a corner where they could eat peacefully. The mother of the family, with tears in her eyes, thanked him and confessed that since arriving in the country, no one had treated them with such respect and kindness. "Here, no one is a stranger," Simon replied with a smile. "This is a place for everyone." That response resonated in his mind like a revelation. Each time he served a dish, each time he attended a table, he felt he was building a new version of himself, one that had a deeper purpose than the superficiality of his old ambitions. He began to understand the value of humility, of listening, and of connecting with the realities of others. One afternoon, as he cleaned the tables after service, Mr. Walter approached Simon and thanked him for the effort he had put into the restaurant since his return. Simon, surprised, set aside the cleaning cloth and looked at Mr. Walter, unsure how to express the gratitude he felt towards him. "Mr. Walter, you didn't have to give me a second chance, but you did," Simon said, his voice trembling. "You've allowed me to see that there is another way to live, and I am deeply grateful. I will never forget what I have learned here, nor your generosity." Mr. Walter, always compassionate, smiled at him and gave him a pat on the shoulder. "Simon, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do to correct them. This place is as much yours as it is mine, and everything you do to help here will also be part of your redemption." Over time, Simon began to notice profound changes within himself. The luxuries he once considered essential no longer mattered to him, and the people he surrounded himself with were now there not out of interest, but for the genuine bond they built day by day. Even the diners, who had initially looked at him with distrust, began to see him as an important figure in the restaurant, someone who was there not out of obligation, but because he had found a genuine cause. One day, while reviewing the wall of gratitude, Simon decided to leave his own message. He carefully wrote, "To Mr. Walter, who taught me the true value of humility, thank you for giving me a purpose and the opportunity to be a better person." As he placed the note on the wall, he felt that he had finally closed a chapter of his life, leaving behind the weight of his old arrogance. From that day on, Simon became one of the most committed members of the team, working side by side with Mr. Walter, Emma, Charlie, and the others. He understood that his redemption was not a single moment, but a constant endeavor, a daily choice to serve others with respect and love. And in that process, he found not only a second chance, but a reason to live with a deeper purpose. Mr. Walter's restaurant, the house of everyone, had also become his home, a place where he discovered that, through service, he could achieve a happiness and satisfaction he had never experienced before. And as he closed the restaurant each night, Simon knew that, in that cozy corner, he had left his past behind and had found the true essence of his being. One day, the community decided to organize an event to recognize the impact that the house of everyone had had on their lives. The neighbors, moved by the gratitude and respect they felt for Mr. Walter and his team, planned a ceremony in the restaurant itself. When the team learned about the preparations, they initially tried to refuse, as they had never worked seeking recognition. However, the community insisted. They wanted to express their gratitude and show Mr. Walter and everyone involved how important their work was. On the night of the ceremony, the restaurant was overflowing. Entire families, elderly people, young people, and children gathered, some bringing flowers, others simply with a smile and a sparkle of excitement in their eyes. The atmosphere was warm and vibrant, filled with laughter and lively conversations. It was a special occasion, and the team, although somewhat overwhelmed by the attention, felt a deep and sincere joy. The first person to speak was Mrs. Alice, who had been a close friend of Mr. Walter for many years. She stepped up to the front and, with an emotional voice, shared what the restaurant meant to her and her family. "This place is a refuge for all of us," she said with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Walter, you and your team have shown us that even though life is hard, there is always a corner where we can find comfort and hope. For me, this restaurant is like a second home." Mrs. Alice's words touched everyone present, and many nodded, recognizing the feelings shared in her remarks. Then, one by one, several regular diners stepped forward to share their stories. An elderly man told how, after losing his wife, the restaurant had offered him companionship and friendship. A young student spoke about how Charlie and Frank's kindness had inspired him to improve and help others in his own school. Each story was a testament to how the restaurant had transformed lives in a way that went far beyond just a meal. In the middle of the ceremony, a group of neighborhood children, who had been helped by Charlie and other young members of the team, presented a special surprise. They had prepared a small play where they reenacted scenes from the restaurant, Mr. Walter welcoming diners with his warm smile, Simon serving dishes kindly, and Frank preparing food diligently in the kitchen. The children portrayed each team member, mimicking their gestures and typical phrases, causing everyone to laugh and feel a connection. When the play ended, Emma, who had been watching everything with tears in her eyes, stepped forward and, with a voice trembling with emotion, spoke on behalf of the team. "This place would be nothing without you," she said, looking at every person present. "The house of everyone is possible because each of you has given it meaning. You have allowed us to be part of your lives, and that is the greatest honor we could have." Applause rang out in the restaurant, and many of those present came forward to hug and congratulate Mr. Walter, Emma, Simon, and every member of the team. Charlie, unable to stop smiling, was surrounded by his friends, who congratulated him for his dedication. For him, seeing so many people gathered in honor of Mr. Walter and the restaurant was a dream come true. After the speeches, the neighbors presented a plaque that read, "To Mr. Walter and the team of the House of Everyone, in gratitude for your love and service to the community." The plaque was installed on the main wall of the restaurant, a lasting reminder of the impact the place had had on the lives of everyone who passed through. For Mr. Walter, that night was one of the most important moments of his life. As he looked at each person in the restaurant, he felt a mix of gratitude and humility. He would never have imagined that, in his old age, he would find such a profound mission or become such a beloved figure to so many people. For him, everything he had done in the restaurant was a natural act, an expression of his desire to help and serve, expecting nothing in return. At the end of the night, as people began to say their goodbyes, Mr. Walter stood by the plaque, touching it gently with a nostalgic smile. Emma, Simon, Charlie, and Frank approached and surrounded him, and together they shared a moment of silence, understanding the magnitude of what they had built. Emma, with a hand on Mr. Walter's shoulder, summarized what everyone felt in that moment. "Mr. Walter, you have done something beautiful. You have taught us all that the true value of a person lies in the love and dedication with which they treat others. This place is your legacy, and all of us are part of it." Mr. Walter nodded, moved to his core, and smiled at his teammates. He knew that the community had recognized his work, but for him, the true recognition was in the relationships he had built, in the bonds of love and respect that connected each person in that place. As time went on, life in the restaurant continued to fill the community with joy and hope. However, one morning, Mr. Walter woke up feeling a special calm, a deep peace that told him it was time to leave his legacy in the hands of those who accompanied him. He knew his health was beginning to deteriorate, and while it was hard for him to imagine his life without the restaurant, he understood that everything in life had a cycle. Mr. Walter decided to gather his team for an important conversation. He called them one by one: Emma, Charlie, Frank, and Simon. They all looked at him with respect and a slight fear in their hearts, sensing that something profound was about to happen. Sitting around one of the tables in the restaurant, in the warm atmosphere they all loved, Mr. Walter spoke from the bottom of his heart. "My dear friends," he began, in a soft but firm voice, "you have been the reason this restaurant has thrived and become the refuge it is today. Each of you has put your love, work, and dedication into this place. And that's why I know that, even though I may no longer be here, the house of everyone, will continue to be that special corner we have created together. The team listened, moved, and in Charlie's eyes, tears shone that he could barely hold back. For him, Mr. Walter was more than a mentor. He was like a grandfather, a figure who had shown him the way to a life of kindness and generosity. Simon, who now understood the true value of humility and service, felt that his words were a gift he could never repay. Emma, always strong, also held back tears, knowing that Mr. Walter had marked her life forever. "I know that each of you has grown in this place and that you have found a mission here," Mr. Walter continued. "But I want you to remember something. The mission of this restaurant is not just mine, but all of yours. Each of you has something unique to offer, and that is what will keep our vision alive. This place is your home, and I trust that you will care for it with the same love that I have." Emma, visibly emotional, took his hand and spoke with a trembling voice. "Mr. Walter, you have taught us the value of generosity and humility. Thanks to you, we have all learned what it truly means to help and to be part of something greater than ourselves. This restaurant is your legacy, and we will carry it forward in your name." Charlie, unable to contain himself, gave him a tight hug, as if fearing to lose him. Mr. Walter stroked the boy's hair, understanding how much his presence in the restaurant meant to him. Frank, with his head bowed, felt that he owed Mr. Walter the peace and purpose he had found in that place, and he silently promised to take care of the restaurant and its values. That afternoon, after their conversation, the team decided that Mr. Walter should not leave without a proper farewell. The news spread quickly, and the next day, the restaurant filled with people who wanted to thank him for everything he had done for the community. Entire families, elderly people, young people, friends and neighbors came to say goodbye, each sharing words of gratitude and affection. Mrs. Alice, his friend for so many years, was one of the first to arrive. She took Mr. Walter's hand and, with tears in her eyes, thanked him for being her friend, her confidant, and her support. "This place is what it is thanks to you, Walter. Never forget that," she told him, and he responded with a smile full of peace. During the day, people approached him, some with small gifts, others with sincere words, reflecting the impact of his work on their lives. One by one, they shared stories, telling him how they had found comfort, support, and companionship in the restaurant. Mr. Walter listened, moved, and with every word, he felt that his life had had a purpose that went beyond what he had ever dreamed. Charlie, on behalf of the young people who worked at the restaurant and considered him an inspiring figure, dedicated some words to him at the end of the day. "Mr. Walter, you have taught me what kindness and generosity are," he said, his voice trembling. "I want you to know that I will take care of this place as you did. I promise that I will make the house of everyone a place that always reflects your spirit." Mr. Walter hugged him tightly, feeling in that boy the promise that the restaurant would continue to be a home for all. He knew that in the hearts of Charlie and all those who accompanied him, his vision would remain alive. At the end of the afternoon, when the restaurant fell silent, Mr. Walter took one last look at every corner, every table, at the photos on the walls, and silently said goodbye to the place that had been his refuge and purpose. The team stayed by his side, sharing that moment of farewell, and together they promised to keep the spirit of the house of everyone alive, always in honor of Mr. Walter. As he stepped out, Mr. Walter felt at peace, with a full heart and the certainty that his life had left an indelible mark on the community. It had been a simple goodbye, but filled with love and gratitude, a dignified farewell for a man who lived his life devoted to serving others. And although he was leaving, he knew that his legacy would remain in every dish served, in every smile shared, and in every act of generosity that happened in the house of everyone. After Mr. Walter's farewell, the restaurant continued with its mission, just as he had dreamed. Although the absence of the elderly man filled the atmosphere with nostalgia, his spirit remained present in every corner of the house of everyone. His legacy had become the center of the place, and all the team members were determined to honor it. Emma naturally assumed a leadership role. Now that Mr. Walter was no longer there, she took on the task of guiding the team, upholding their values, and always remembering the elderly man's teachings. Whenever a difficulty or doubt arose, Emma would ask herself what Mr. Walter would have done, and in that way, she found the clarity and serenity to continue. Under her direction, the restaurant remained true to its original vision, and the house of everyone continued to be an accessible and welcoming space for all. Charlie, for his part, felt inspired to give even more of himself. To him, Mr. Walter had been a father figure, an example of kindness and humility, and every day in the restaurant was his way of honoring him. Over time, Charlie became a reference point in the community. The other young people saw him as a leader, and motivated by his enthusiasm, began to join as volunteers in the restaurant. Charlie, now with more responsibilities, helped in the kitchen, attended to diners, and organized activities for the neighbors. His energy and commitment conveyed the essence of Mr. Walter and kept his memory alive. Frank also took on an important role in the team. Always remembering the opportunity that Mr. Walter had given him, he managed the kitchen with a dedication that demonstrated the deep respect he felt for his mentor. Every dish he prepared was a tribute to Mr. Walter, and he always made sure that diners received food that was not only well made, but also filled with love and care. His connection with the community grew, and soon the neighbors knew and admired him for his commitment. For Frank, the restaurant was not just a job. It was the chance to give back to the world the kindness he had received. Simon, who had undergone a transformation thanks to Mr. Walter's generosity, became a fundamental pillar of the restaurant. Although his years of arrogance were behind him, Simon worked day by day to earn the trust of the community. Now, many diners recognized him and greeted him affectionately, reminding him how much his life had changed since he first entered the house of everyone as a repentant man. Simon began to organize charity events and collaborate with other community organizations, expanding the restaurant's influence and strengthening its bond with the neighborhood. Thanks to his personal redemption, Simon found peace and purpose in serving others. 6 months after his farewell from the restaurant, Mr. Walter passed away peacefully. It was a calm morning, in the simple bed of his home, surrounded by silence and serenity. His last breath faded like a whisper, and his heart stopped forever. The news of his death spread throughout the neighborhood, and sadness took hold of every corner of the community that had loved him so much. Mr. Walter had been to them a figure of kindness and a symbol of humility, someone who, with his life, had shown the power of generosity and the value of empathy. On the day of his funeral, the small neighborhood church was filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, reflecting the diversity of the community that Mr. Walter had inspired and united. Entire families, elderly people, young people, and even children gathered to say goodbye to the man who had changed their lives in such a profound way. The walls of the church were adorned with flowers and messages of gratitude, reminders of the countless lives he had touched with his kindness. Emma, Charlie, Frank, and Simon were seated in the front row, visibly moved. For them, Mr. Walter was not only a mentor, but also a guide, someone who had ignited a flame in their hearts, a purpose that would forever accompany them. During the ceremony, Emma addressed the attendees with a voice that tried to remain steady, although her eyes reflected the deep sadness she felt. Mr. Walter taught us that true greatness lies in the kindness and love with which we treat others. Today we bid farewell to a humble man, but his life left a mark on all of us that will never be erased. Every day we work at the house of everyone, every smile we share will be a tribute to his memory. Charlie, unable to hold back his tears, approached the coffin and placed a note inside. It was a simple message. "Thank you, Mr. Walter. I promise to follow your example." For the young boy, that commitment was sacred, and although his heart was broken, he knew that every step he took in the restaurant would be a homage to the life of his beloved mentor. As people approached to say their goodbyes, a reflection began to resonate in the air. a question many carried in their hearts. Where is Mr. Walter now? Some thought of heaven, of a place of peace, surrounded by love. Others felt that his spirit lived on in the house of everyone, in every dish served and in every act of kindness that took place there. But deep down, they all agreed that Mr. Walter was present in the hearts of every person he had inspired. The news of his death, when it became public, touched many people beyond the neighborhood. The story of Mr. Walter and his restaurant resonated in local and national media, and soon, the House of Everyone became a symbol of hope and generosity throughout the country. People from other places began to visit the restaurant, drawn by the legacy of love and humility he had left behind. Lines stretched out onto the street, and the team worked tirelessly to welcome each new visitor with the warmth and respect Mr. Walter had taught them. As a result of this notoriety, the restaurant thrived like never before. Donations increased, and with them, the team was able to expand their services, offering free meals to more people and extending their help to other communities. The House of Everyone was no longer just a restaurant. It had become a movement, an inspiration motivating others to replicate Mr. Walter's mission in their own neighborhoods and cities. Emma, Charlie, Frank, and Simon kept Mr. Walter's legacy alive with each passing day. They knew they were fulfilling the promise they had made to him, and in every corner of the restaurant, the presence of that man who had united them and had taught them the true meaning of kindness could be felt. The wall of gratitude, now filled with messages, became a sacred place, a corner where people could remember Mr. Walter and thank him for the light he had brought to their lives. At the end of each day, Charlie, now a young man with a heart full of ideals, would spend a few moments in silence in front of Mr. Walter's picture, recalling the lessons he had left him. Sometimes he would ask, quietly, "Where are you, Mr. Walter?" But deep down, he knew the answer. Mr. Walter lived in every smile, in every act of generosity, in every shared dish at the House of Everyone. The story of Mr. Walter invites us to reflect. Where are we really when we depart from this world? Is our place merely a memory in the minds of others, or is it a legacy that continues to live through our actions? Mr. Walter demonstrated that, although the body may fade, the spirit of generosity and love we cultivate can remain, guiding and transforming others long after our departure. His life was proof that the true value of a person is not in what they accumulate, but in what they give. In the end, Mr. Walter did not take riches or material possessions with him. He took with him a heart full of love and left in this world an inheritance of kindness and humanity that would endure forever. Mr. Walter is where our best actions are, in every corner where generosity and empathy shine. He is in every person who decides, in a moment of doubt, to lend a hand, offer a smile, share a dish. In every act of love, there lives Mr. Walter. Thank you for joining us until the end. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe, and activate the bell to not miss our upcoming videos. We'll see you next time. Take care and see you soon.